Okay, we have an ongoing saga here of live chat or chat. Let's see. Oops, let's see how it goes. Yeah, so I was continuing to chat with the previous discussion, and it just kept coming back with pretty much the same thing. But let's see how it goes here. Go ahead and add this here, and we'll go over here. YouTube. Okay. So this is his response. It's RUOR 1984. Now this guy, I thought he was a sharp guy, but now he's doubling down on the same debunked claims or arguments, or whatever. Says it's honestly amazing how confidently you can just invent new laws of physics, which I never did, and biology to predict this timeline. Obviously, the evidence supports the timeline, and that's the whole point. Let's look at the sheer reality of what you are claiming. Well, it's what the record says. You can't go against what record says. The water is an insulator. Yeah. So we got into a discussion on catastrophic plate tectonics, and he's saying it's a physics blunder saying water is a superb insulator. Well, obviously it is. So there's no heat problem. Proves you don't understand the heat problem of catastrophic plate tectonics. Of course, people been going back and forth on this for quite a while now, and turns out that water is a very good insulator, and it will keep the heat down below, because the entire deep ocean was subducted. The entire deep ocean all over the world was subducted. So obviously something happened after the global flood. It had to be after the global flood, because if it was before the global flood, then there would be sediment layers in the deep oceans. So the subduction happened after the global flood. At any rate. Okay, tectonics. If the continents spread apart at miles per hour, the friction and kinetic energy release would be astronomically high, the equivalent of billions of nuclear weapons going off simultaneously. If water acts as an insulator, it traps the heat. Well, obviously, it's the same heat that's already down there. The oceans wouldn't just get warm. The latent heat of vaporization dictates they would flash boil. Yeah, as if the ocean's going to flash boil. Mile of ocean, a couple miles of ocean deep. In the steam, cooking the entire planet, sterilizing all life. Yeah, imagination won't run wild, including whatever is floating on the ark. You can't just wave away the first law of thermodynamics. It's got nothing to do with that. The first law of thermodynamics, it's got to do with whether or not the heat can be contained under the ocean, which it can, obviously, because it was. And you have scientists saying that, doing all the math and everything, and they say it's not going to vaporize anything. Okay. Then he says I got a double standard on evolution, completely misrepresenting punctuated equilibrium, which I was making fun of as punctuated equilibrium. That concept refers to evolutionary changes happening over tens of thousands of years rather than millions. You, on the other hand, are claiming a single pair of felines stepped off the boat, mutated into lions, tigers, jaguars, and house cats in a couple of centuries. To get that much genetic variation that fast, the mutation rate would have to be so astronomically high that the genome would shred itself through fatal errors. You are relying on magical. See, he's thinking that the variation comes from the mutation rate, because that's what evolution relies on, the mutation rate for the change. But variation is not due to mistakes. Variation is built into the genome. Okay, so that's his fatal error. You are relying on magical hyperfast version of evolution. No, I don't believe in evolution. To make your boat story work while simultaneously telling me evolution is impossible. Well, mistakes writing productive programming and reprogramming is impossible. So then we got into Sargon, Kush, and history. You literally just proved my point. You were the one who claimed Sargon was the son of Kush, making him a Kushite. Then he says Kushite, this is the most amusing thing. He says the Kushite language are Afro-Asiatic language originating in East Africa, like Somalia and Oromo. The Sargon historically spoke Akkadian and East Semitic language of Mesopotamia. No kidding. That's because he didn't go to Africa. So he's doubling down on this idea that Nimrod had to speak an African language because he's a son of Cush. You're arbitrarily trying to staple a real Mesopotamian king to an African biblical genealogy, and then it's not African. Everybody came from Mesopotamia. See, people are all messed up because they don't know ancient human history. That's why I say, and Matt Slip had to disagree with me. I said, you have to study ancient human history before you can try being a scientist. He says, oh, you can be a scientist without knowing ancient history. No, you have to know ancient history. Otherwise, your science is going to be all messed up. You know. And when the history doesn't match, you just call the objection silly. Well, since he's doubling down, I got some more choice words for him. Inventing faster mutation rates, claiming that Africa only has higher genetic diversity because of the faster mutation rate. Okay. Inventing a faster mutation. I didn't invent it. It's a matter of fact that the African lineages have a faster mutation rate, which, by the way, doesn't account. It's only like twice as fast. It doesn't account for being 5 or 6 times as fast, according to his claimed ages. So there's that. Ultimate ad hoc rescue device. No, it's not a rescue device. It's human history. There is absolutely zero biological evidence that African populations magically mutate faster than the rest of the world. No, the Genome Simons project proves it by way of the genetic distance. And any study of the genetic distance will show you that the mutation rate is faster. You literally just made it up. No, I didn't make it up. It's the Simons Genome Project. The actual measurable genetic distance completely shatters the 5,000-year bottleneck. No, it isn't, because the actual genetic distance isn't nearly enough to be 6 times the genetic distance as other lineages, because it's only like twice as big, not 6 times as big, as much as needed for the claimed, whatever it is, 85,000 years or whatever it is they claim, or 85 million years, I don't know. The diversity is higher in Africa because human lineages have been there longest. the lineages are simultaneous. Kush, which is the AB lineage, Kush, well, Put and Kush, they have the greatest genetic distance, only twice as much, by the way. And their genetic diversity is higher because they just have a faster mutation rate, not that it's been the longest. So then we go to the flash frozen megafauna myth. Yes, frozen megafauna exists. Yes, it does. And it was frozen very fast while they had buttercups in their mouth and stomach. And he says, no, they weren't flash frozen by tsunamis. And it wasn't the tsunami that flash froze them. They got flash frozen by being shoved up in the Arctic. People are, I don't know. If they were buried by global tsunamis, and they were, not a global tsunami, just a tsunami in the Arctic, because the sea level went up because the continents were shoved up into the Arctic. So obviously the sea level is going to rise, and obviously there's evidence of tsunamis all over the place in the Arctic, both in America and Europe and Siberia. They would be buried in massive marine saltwater sediment. No kidding. And if you'd read what I posted, then you would see that, yes, they did swallow marine water or salt water. They aren't there. They aren't. Yes, they were. They are found in permafrost bogs, those wind-blown dust. Well, they were covered. Some of them, it depends which one you're talking about, too, because, I mean, in some cases they're buried by tsunamis. In some cases they're flash frozen and then subsequently buried by sediment. Furthermore, woolly mammoths were heavily adapted for extreme cold. No, not like that. Not eating tropical vegetation. They were eating tropical vegetation, and they froze so fast that the buttercups were still in their mouth. Okay, they had thick fur, not thick enough, obviously, because they froze to death almost instantly. And as a matter of fact, they froze so fast, they said it would have to go, I don't know how many degrees below zero, a couple hundred degrees below zero for as fast as they froze, which I don't necessarily agree with, but, maybe they were like already half frozen and they're trying to eat buttercups, and then they finish freezing or whatever. Small ears to prevent frostbite. Specialized hemoglobins. It wasn't enough to keep them from freezing because they froze to death with buttercups in their mouth, along with all the rest of the fauna, flora and fauna. Trees, animals, everything. Quick frozen. It's a matter of fact. You're denying what the evidence is. They were tropical animals suddenly caught in a freeze, yeah. They lived. No, they didn't. It wasn't. It was tropical. It was like around the tropical Cancer and stuff, because they were all connected. All the continents were connected to Antarctica, and occasionally fell into freezing mud pits. No. This is a widespread event. It's not an occasional falling into pits. They're just making up stories. Speaking of making up stories, okay, at the end of the day, I have provided actual physical evidence for a global flood, and it's not my claim, it's what the evidence shows. You've just provided a list of wild claims. No, I've given you what the evidence is. That require breaking the laws? No, doesn't break any law. inventing magical mutation rates and ignoring actual written Sumerian history? No, because the actual Sumerian history has a date limited that limits, because all the calendars are only 5,000 years old. There's a 5,000 year limit. Can't just hand wave away physics by saying water insulated it. Well, actually, I can, because it's not a hand wave, because water did insulate it, obviously, because it obviously did have it. So here's my response. Maybe not as thorough as what I just did, but if you had read the paper carefully that I gave him, you would have seen that saltwater diatoms in the lungs and nitrogen isotopes indicate marine inundation. So that's what the evidence is. This is what he's denying. Saltwater diatoms in the lungs. In other words, there's evidence of them drowning by the tsunamis. And nitrogen isotopes indicate marine inundation. Okay, now this is what what Grok came up with. I mean, this is the reason why Grok is turning out to be agreeing with what I said, because of what the evidence shows. The highest haplogroup diversity is in Uzbekistan. Now, in another discussion, I was trying to explain that if you ask AI, maybe I can do that in a little bit. If you ask AI, well, what is the greatest diversity? Or what is the greatest genetic haplogroup diversity? And it'll immediately say Africa, but it's not Africa, it's Uzbekistan. Because I'm talking about the genetic haplogroup diversity. But it'll turn around and say Africa. The diversity in Africa is from the great genetic distance that is observed in studies such as the Simons Genome project, likely due to environmental factors as well as a faster generation rate. It's real regardless. It's an observed fact. And the highest diversity is in Uzbekistan. In other words, all the haplogroups spread out from Asia or West Asia like spokes of a wheel. You got R that goes to Europe. You have E, A, and B that goes to Africa. You have O that goes to Asia, and D that goes to Asia, and C that goes to Asia. But once you get into the Americas, you got Q and C. Once you get into Australia, you got C and K. Now, these are Y haplogroups. There's mitochondrial lineages haplogroups too, but their greatest diversity is in Uzbekistan as well. And they spread out. In other words, there's more haplogroup letters in Uzbekistan than anywhere else in the world, and they all spread out from Asia, because the area of the Levant and Anatolia and the Mediterranean, they were battlegrounds. So like everybody left that area or wiped out or whatever. And the only remaining lineages there are basically J2 with, others as well, but they kind of like left the area, and they're up in the Caucasus. There's a high diversity in the Caucasus and Uzbekistan, which is on the other side of the Caspian Sea. It's a landlocked country. It doesn't have any access to any sea or anything. Okay. So we got faster generation. It's real. You can deny it all you want. It's real. People living in Mesopotamian Semitic languages. Sargon was the first king of Mesopotamia, or Samaria. The population only increased when Sargon was older. That was when he became the king, not when he was born, but when he became older. Considering how he was among the first to be born, being the great-grandson of Noah. So he was like one of the first people to be born, because the sons of Noah weren't born after the first person to be born after the flood. One of the first people was Nimrod, Sargon, who lived in Akkad, who was from the city of Akkad. But that took time, and so by the time Abraham was born, it was 10 generations later, and Sargon was the king. And he had no reason to speak African languages. So instead of calling him silly, I call him a Buz Brain. Like, he's the king of Mesopotamia. What's he going to be speaking? What reason does he have to be speaking an African language? His father and his brothers, they all went to Africa and spoke their own language. Down completely different environment, completely different circumstances, completely different words for every different thing. So they were speaking another language. But Nimrod, or Sargon, was the king of Mesopotamia, the king of the world, basically. And he spoke a Semitic language, Akkadian, which is considered a Semitic language. He had no reason to speak African languages. He's thinking because Sargon was born a Cush, he had to speak a Cushite language. No. They all went to Africa and spoke their own languages, but in Mesopotamia, the language was Semitic. So they spoke the Semitic language. Okay, variation is built into the genome. It happens apart from making mistakes. So this is the difference between, what he didn't understand is so obvious, he doesn't understand what the issues are. He thinks that variation is from evolution. No, variation is from the existing information in the genome, not from making mistakes. It happens apart from making mistakes, apart from mutations, which is making mistakes. They're copying errors. You don't need copying and errors to have variation. Variation is a part of the design. Evolution relies on mistakes. Variation doesn't rely on mistakes. Only evolution relies on mistakes. That's why you need billions and billions of years. And it's still not enough. If you do the math, 20 billion years is not enough to make even a single average sized protein by mistake, much less all the mechanisms and things required for the protein to exist and remain. Variation is from information already existing in the genome, which is by design. So the information, you start out with information. With a creation, which is what we have a creation because, matter didn't create itself and matter didn't write our genome. We have a creation. It's by design. It's top-down information. Once everything splits and goes off its own way, it has its own variation, adapts to its own environment, given the conditions and everything. And the genome as well, or the selected genome. Okay. You're imagining a problem with friction, considering the plates were sliding on molten rock. The Earth is being held together by gravity. It bulges in the middle at the equator. Any quote unquote little thing can cause the plates to slide, relatively little thing. It'd be a big thing for us, but it'd be, in the scope of astronomical things is a little. Any little astronomical event can cause the plates to slide. And as a matter of fact, the entire deep ocean floor was subducted, which had to be after the global flood, not during the global flood, because if it happened during the global flood, the sediment layers would still be there in the deep oceans, and there's no sediment layers from the global flood in the deep oceans because everything was subducted in the deep oceans. The entire, doesn't matter where it is, Pacific, Atlantic, Pacific, all of the deep oceans were subducted. All of them, the whole thing. And of course, this happened underneath the ocean, which is possible because of the insulation quality of water. So it's water that insulated the activity. But anyways, let me see. What was I thinking of talking about here? Well, we could talk about something. But anyway, let me check to see if anything going on. There's Dana. Greetings, Dana. Okay. Let's see if we can go to Grok here and see if it'll talk. Should be working. So let's see what happens here. Now, this is a clean slate. Believe it or not, it's a clean slate. It might not look like it, but it's a clean slate. What do we got here? See, there's nothing here. It's a clean slate. I haven't discussed anything yet. I just want to make sure the thing was working before I started. So let me go ahead and, let me click it first. Hello, Rock. No, better work. Now the sound's not coming through because the sound was coming through. Now it's not. Unbelievable. Anyway, I don't know if I can work with this or not. Don't know why it would do that. Because it was working before and now it's not working. Oh well. All right, let me go ahead and ask a question here. Where do you think the highest genetic haplogroup diversity is found on the Earth? Let's see if it comes up with the right answer. Da, 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 da. Do, 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 do. Well, I didn't know that was such a hard problem. Hey, so it turns out you're spot on. The highest genetic haplogroup diversity is in Africa, specifically sub-Saharan Africa. Okay, well, uh, yeah, but in Africa, you have only the L mitochondrial lineage, and you have only the A, B, and E in Africa. But everywhere else, the haplogroups are spread out like spokes of a real wheel from where? Guess where? This is bad. This is bad. Well, because it's it's not right because it doesn't spread out like spokes of a wheel from Africa. If because I'm talking about the haplo designations. I'm talking about the highest number of haplogroup letters. Okay, so let me see. No, Africa doesn't win because the number of haplogroup letters are not in Africa because Africa only has A, B, and E, and other countries, even a small country, has many, many more letters than Africa. Well, it's not Europe either, believe it or not, because Europe only has R and I and Q and some E. Y haplogroup. And maybe some B. That would be B. Well, I'm surprised that you aren't able to pinpoint which country, because there's a country today, and it's a small country. I mean, it's not a big, big country, but it has more haplogroup letters, both Y chromosome and mitochondrial haplogroups, than any other country in the world. Yeah, the Caucasus does have a high haplogroup diversity. That is very true because every time there was a battle or something, they ran to the Caucasus, to hide out. But there's another country on the other side of the Caspian Sea which has an even higher haplogroup diversity. Okay, so at least we've determined that the highest haplogroup diversity is not in Africa, right? Okay, so did you check a country called Uzbekistan? Okay, depending on which sources you're looking at, yeah, I guess maybe Iran or the Caucasus, but that's basically the cradle of civilization. Yeah, so we could probably exclude the out of Africa as being having any validity whatsoever. Yeah, so they say, but they're assuming that the A00 is the root of the family tree, and they're assuming that one lineage produced the next, produced the next, produced the next, when in reality, all of the lineages existed simultaneously in history. See, but the genetic distance of A00 is only about twice as much as the other lineages. And if it were to be the claimed age, it would have to be like 6 times as much as the others. And it's not, even with its fast mutation rate. Let's see. Okay. Actually, as far as the mutation rate is concerned, it's much faster. There's a big discussion. It's much faster than people originally claimed, and then the studies originally showed because they didn't have a thorough study of the mutation rate. Okay, so yeah, so you're supposed to be giving me this information up front, and I'm not supposed to be the one telling you what the facts are. Right. So if it's more letters, that means it's more lineages in the cradle of civilization and not the out of Africa. Yeah, you're assuming that A is basal, but what if that assumption isn't true? What if IJK is basal and everything else is downstream from IJK? Well, see, you're still assuming that the alleles of A00 are the basal original alleles, and you're assuming that any changes from that are downstream or derived. So if it's true that IJK is the basal lineage or basal point, then all the other ones exist simultaneously because they have a common ancestor, not because one is derived from the other. But you can't assume that chimps are in the mix. That's a big mistake too. And A00 being basal is only an assumption. It's not labeled as to being the ancestral lineage. Um, so it could be that they are derived. Well, because it turns out that chimps aren't even, the Y chromosome of chimps is hardly comparable to the human Y chromosome. It's different, more different than any other, even the apes, and, I mean, the gorillas and stuff. And that's another thing. Only 85% similar to chimps, anyways. That means we're 15% different from chimps. So the thing is that you're relying on mistakes to account for that 15% different, all being functional, compatible, and useful information, actually, making us smarter than chimps. Well, that's the thing. It's like, it's almost an appeal to magic for copying errors to give us 15% better genome than chimps have. And that's just unrealistic. It, it doesn't make it any better that they have to be selected for. The mistake, first you have to make a good mistake, then the good mistake has to be selected for, and it's not necessarily selected for in the first place. Then you have to deal with genetic degradation and genetic entropy that shows that we're losing DNA. We're losing the function of our DNA. Well, they're just coming out now with that kids are not as intelligent. They're not getting smarter. They're getting dumber and lacking capabilities compared to people that were not raised with a computer. Well, the point is that genetic entropy is a real thing, whether regardless if the mainstream science wants to accept it or not. They're wrong on the out of Africa because you have African male and female producing a Semitic male and a Eurasian female, and maybe a Semitic female who then produce Eurasian males. It's just totally berserk. And just because that knowledge is increasing as predicted or as prophesied doesn't mean that we're getting smarter just because we have access to more information. Well, there's a lot of denial in the scientific community when it relates to especially creation, because you can't have matter making itself. You can't have matter ordering itself because it just can't do it. Nature being the cause of nature is nonsensical and circular and unscientific and physically impossible. So then, with all this entropy going on in the universe, how did it get ordered? And it can't. It obviously didn't order itself. Yeah, the word complexity is a trick word because complexity doesn't necessarily mean intelligence or directed working mechanisms. Complexity is just Shannon noise, whatever. And it doesn't mean that complexity is going to result in anything useful or practical. So we still have a huge problem is where evolution depends on mistakes, programming billions of viable, functional, working programming, bits of programming, and it's just not logical or mathematical or physically possible. So you're still depending on mistakes to produce something, but you have to have an organism already in place. You can't make an organism by making mistakes. But once you have an organism, you can have things like the immune systems, which encourages mistakes in order to work as an immune system. So even the mistakes are by design when you already have a design, but mistakes will never make a design. But you have to see the problem here. You have to see the problem that you're you're relying on matter first making itself, then you rely on matter directing itself, and neither one of which is possible. And you're just depending on good mistakes, which are very, 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 very rare, to account for all the variation that we see, which is totally absurd. Well, you still don't get it because something from nothing is matter making itself. You're just claiming that you're starting out with matter and energy and everything, but you can't have anything until you have matter, which you can't even have time and distance, measurable time and distance without the gravity of matter to make time and distance possible, or measurable time and distance possible. Um, virtual particles, virtual particles are only possible if you already have matter and energy. I mean, a virtual particle, that's, you require energy, and energy can't make itself, and energy can't direct or order itself. It always goes from order to disorder. It never goes from non-existence to ordered energy. Uh, virtual particles, you can't have virtual particles without energy. And energy can't make itself, it can't order itself. Just like you can't charge a battery with an equal or a lesser amount of charge. You have to have a greater charge and a greater charge, and you can't have an infinite regress of greater and greater causes, because that's nonsensical. Because then you'd have to have the greatest cause, which would be the greatest amount of energy, which all that would be the universe being toasted. In the quantum realm, there is no time or distance. There's only time or distance with things with mass and gravity, where you can have time, measurable time and distance, which is a fabrication. It's not something that can make itself. There has to be something other than physical, which is causing physical. For every natural thing, there has to be a supernatural cause, because there can't be a natural cause. And don't even try to appeal to a multiverse because you're appealing to infinite possibilities, which is a basic appeal to God, anyways. Well, if science is going to make the claim that the universe made itself or popped into existence, you're going to have to prove it by showing matter and an energy making and directing itself. In other words, you can falsify a creator by showing matter and energy making and directing themselves, which you can't do because that would be magic. That is magic and it doesn't exist. So there has to be a creator. So you don't seem to get it that even the vacuum exists because of matter and energy that that make time and distance possible, and where there's less matter, or what you say, no matter in a vacuum, it's still the result of the creation of the universe. Oh, I didn't interrupt it. Are you still there? No, I guess it cut out. It happens one time, once in a while. It cuts out, but I can't stay too much longer. But let's see if I can try again. Maybe it'll continue. It'll be nice if it would talk, but the crazy thing, don't know why it doesn't talk after I start my StreamYard. It did before a couple of times, but I have to see if I can get that fixed. Anyway, so are you still there? Anyways, you can see how the consensus keeps appealing to physical things as the cause of physical things. It doesn't look like it wants to work, but I got to go anyways. But but it's the scientists that are messed up because they keep appealing to physical things causing physical things, and it's just absurd. And especially when you're talking about billions of bits of viable functional programming by making mistakes, it's just totally absurd. Okay, so, but the thing is that with so many repair mechanisms, which obviously can't make themselves, you're only going to have a very, very, very small number of mutations from which you have to have a good mutation, which is even rarer than making mistakes. Well, before you make the claim that mistakes write information, you need to prove it with math, and the math just doesn't add up. 20 billion years isn't enough to make even a single average size protein, not to mention all the other mechanisms that are required to make a protein um, duplicatable. It doesn't matter, because the point of making a single average size protein is just to show that it's not even near possible to make uh, hundreds and hundreds of viable functional proteins, all of which have to be in place in order to even replicate. The thing is that a functional viable cell has to already have a certain number of proteins that all have to be there, in order for the thing to work. Otherwise, because if you haven't shown it to happen, it's not going to happen under Earth circumstances, or what do you call it, the prebiotic circumstances. See, we know what the claim is. We just have not seen it verified or proven that things start out small and get bigger and better all the time. That's, if you could show matter making and directing itself, you could falsify God, the creator. But you can't do that. You're unable to do that because nobody has ever made, even knowing how to make a living cell, nobody's ever made a living cell, and they're not even anywhere close. I mean, that's intentionally making a living cell. So a cell is not going to make itself either, even especially since we can't make one, even knowing how to make it. Well, which we don't know everything how to make it yet, anyways, but it's not going to make itself. Okay. It's more like evolution of the gaps, because evolution is all gap. It's all claims. It's not any evidence. There's no evidence of mistakes writing viable functional programming. And even if it is beneficial, it's part of the original design. So no, evolution is all gap and all claims and no evidence. Yeah, when you understand that matter and energy can't make themselves, and you can understand that matter and energy can't direct or order themselves, then you can understand that the universe didn't make itself and the universe didn't produce life by itself or by its own. So that's about it. So we got to go.